Hey everyone, and welcome to Nat Chat. I'm Nat Eliason, and as you probably know, we're currently exploring what to do as a student or recent graduate trying to succeed outside of the traditional, dissatisfying, and somewhat broken college system. In this episode, I'm joined again by Josh Lilien. As I mentioned last time, Josh reached out with a few questions for me around these college topics, and when it became obvious that he had an interesting story of his own and was thinking deeply about these issues, I suggested we get online and let him interview me live as a second episode. We talked about why philosophy is a worthwhile major, the impact of top-tier schools, comparing yourselves to others in and out of school, taking advantage of being a student, and a ton more. So if you enjoyed this episode, please let me know, and maybe I can do a more structured Q&A type episode in the future. It's something that was a lot of fun for me, and if it's valuable to you, I'd love to do more of it. So with that, let's welcome Josh back to the show. Josh, welcome back.
Thank you for having me again.
Yeah, so the audience will have a bit of intro again, and they know that we're doing something a little different here where now you get to play Nat and ask me questions about a lot of the stuff that I've talked about in past episodes. But just as a really quick intro, just in case people haven't listened to the other episode, who are you? What are you working on? How did we get connected?
Awesome. My name is Josh Lilien. I'm a student in university in Montreal, Canada. I've also been working on startups for my whole time in university. I'm currently building a marketing software company that will look and feel like an all-in-one for 1/100th of the price. You can find me at Josh Lilien on Twitter and LinkedIn. So I imagine my name will be spelled there.
And we wanted to do this because you reached out to me when I started the podcast and you had some ideas around it and you had some questions for me too. And I thought it would be fun if we just hopped on, right after the other interview. And if you got to ask those live, and then we'll see if we can make this into an episode of its own for people listening. So yeah, ask away.
Awesome. I'm excited to play Nat. If only I has nice hair. So Nat, you went to Carnegie Mellon, which is without a doubt one of the most prestigious schools in the US. How has going to that top tier school affected, if at all, your career and your work?
Yeah, it's interesting. I didn't think of it that much when I was there. I never thought of it as this super high tier prestigious school. I think that for computer science and engineering and physics, it definitely is. For philosophy, it definitely is not. And it is for business and some other things too. I think that it affected me probably in two ways. One, you get access to really smart people when you go to a top tier school. And that obviously had a big impact. Adil, who was on in the first episode, he and I were the same year there, really good friends. I've been able to connect with a lot of other people who were there at the same time, who were smart, interesting, fun to work with and talk to. And then the other thing is just there's some value in it being a good name in tech and me working with startups where, especially when I was doing some startup work early on, people just sort of assumed that I knew programming and things like that because I went to Carnegie, despite knowing nothing about machine learning or algorithms or any of that stuff, except super surface level. They just sort of would assume that if you went to Carnegie, you knew how to do it. I remember so Adil actually, when he was applying to Y Combinator, he went for his interview. And when they were in the interview room and they were introducing the people on the team, the only thing that they had to say about themselves in terms of the technical side of what they were working on was that they went to Carnegie, despite nobody on the team or despite him not studying anything technical at all. So you get away with that. But I think that's really the main way. I honestly, I never used the resources at the school very much for work. Their startup environment was not very good. So I wouldn't say that it's directly impacted me, but the name brand has been good and the people that you meet really smart. So that is always nice too.
Awesome. I'd love to dive more into the meeting and exposure to smart people thing. Where do you think that sort of had value other than your roommate being Adil, who you met there?
Yeah, I think that it exposes you to more ideas and people working on other interesting things. There weren't a huge number of people that I stayed in touch with that I met really early on there. But the people that I met over the years, like exposed me to other things that I might not have discovered otherwise. So I was in a professional business fraternity, AK Psi. Some of the people in that were just amazing at helping me learn more about startup stuff, marketing stuff, and also exposing me to fields that I ended up not being interested in, like consulting, finance, corporate tech, things like that. That was the main way. And then also just, I mean, some of the people who have come on are people that I met either directly through Carnegie Mellon or who I met through that greater Pittsburgh ecosystem. So Neil Soni, whose interview isn't out yet, but will be coming out soon. He was a couple years ahead of me at CMU. Another guy, Umang Patel, he also went through Y Combinator, and then he was working out in SF, and he helped me get some exposure to that whole area. And then just the Pittsburgh area. I mean, Justin Mayers, whose interview should also be coming out soon. He wrote Traction, really, really good marketing book, which I know you're familiar with. He and I went through the same startup incubator in Pittsburgh at different times. And that was actually how we got connected through the alumni network. I had put out a pitch for a designer who was looking to work with startups. Justin responded to the designer's pitch, asking me to intro them. And then I realized that he was the guy who wrote Traction. And so we started talking about it. And I just asked him if he had any like marketing consulting work that I could pick up. And that was sort of how our, I guess, friendship started, and ended up working on programming for marketers together. So it's a lot of these tangential ways. There was no real systematized like, network, LinkedIn, career center within campus. It was more just like taking advantage of what exposure it does give you.
So would you have any recommendations for the audience who might want to know how to navigate those tangential links to awesome people?
It's hard because all of it is just very serendipitous in that I couldn't have planned any of it from the front, right? It just all sort of happens. It kind of falls into place. And I think that it's really easy to get into a narrative about how these things happen. Like, oh, it was so planned out, and I saw this opportunity and I took it, and then I connected with this person, and then that led to this thing. And honestly, it's all very random, and it just sort of happens by chance. But the only way that it can happen by chance is if you're exposing yourself to those opportunities in the first place. So I have an article about this actually called, the title is How to Get Lucky something. And it's really just about like putting yourself in situations where these good things can happen. So, I mean, one simple example is just going to more parties and more events and just meeting people, because maybe 80% of the time, 90% of the time, you won't meet anybody who you're that interested in following up with, but it's the only way that you have the potential to meet somebody really interesting. Or going through these incubators, like you've done as well, they expose you to all these people, but you have to show up and be a little engaged and give yourself the opportunity to meet people. I think that it's easy to get discouraged sometimes in these large groups when you don't immediately find brilliant people. I don't know about you, but when I was going through the incubator in Pittsburgh, there was a sense on some level of like, oh, how did this person get in here? Like, oh, their idea isn't very good. And right, it's easy to judge the negatives, but if you can turn off that part of your brain a little bit and just focus on seeking out like the really good opportunities, that's going to be the best way to do it. And just kind of sitting back, waiting, trusting that the process is going to lead to good connections and opportunities in the future.
Awesome. I absolutely agree with all that. On a slightly different vein, why philosophy?
Studying philosophy was sort of it was the only option I had in a sense, because when I got to college, I was originally studying business. I was in their business school, and it just totally felt like bullshit. I didn't like any of the classes. The things we were studying didn't make sense in terms of applicability beyond like a classroom and a test. And I'd always been a not great student who could just sort of wing it last minute, cram, and then do okay on exams. And I'd always hated like the tests, studying. It just didn't make sense to me. And I'm pretty sure now that I just don't really learn by lecture or by watching. Like, I can't really learn by YouTube videos. I have a hard time totally understanding something when somebody explains it to me in person. I do way better reading it and doing it myself. And, that just doesn't play well with a college like classroom. So, a big part of it was I was there for my freshman year and taking all these business classes and really hating it, not enjoying school. I had really hoped that when I got to college, it would be way better than high school and that suddenly like, oh, school can be fun now. And it wasn't. And, that was really, really depressing. And it put me in like a pretty bad place for a while. And switching out of it into philosophy, which was just the area that I was most interested in, right? I completely ignored any professional application of it. I just said, okay, what are the classes I like the most? And what do I enjoy doing the most and reading the most in my free time? And that was the philosophy stuff. So switching into that was fantastic because one, I was actually taking classes I liked, where instead of looking at the course catalog and saying, okay, what do I need to take to graduate on time and fulfill my major? It was literally like I could open it up every quarter or every semester and say, okay, what do I want to take, right? What looks interesting? Because I was interested in the classes and the major was so unrestricted and so minimal that you had all this free time to take all these other classes. So I got to take, fiction writing and managing across different cultures and a lot of other psychology stuff and decision science and these other things I was interested in, so that was great. And then also philosophy classes, there's no tests, right? You're never going to take an exam on, oh, what did this person think? What did this person think? Well, okay, you might, but if you're in a class that tests you that way on philosophy, you should drop it and go take a different class because that's not the point, right? The point is to learn how to argue and convey ideas and assess viewpoints and understand what people are trying to say and interpret them generously and, read them back in your own words and offer your own critiques of them. And you do that all in papers and discussions. And that felt so much more natural for me. And obviously it gave me 3 years of very analytical writing experience, which has led to a lot of the stuff that I'm doing now.
I've heard some of my philosophy students say you're actually always in school when you take philosophy. So even at night, you're probably thinking of the paper that you have to be writing. Would you agree with that statement?
I mean, I think that it affects how you think about things in a certain way. So you become much more open to toying with ideas that you don't agree with. I think that's one of the main benefits is that it shows you how to, generously interpret and reflect an idea that might make you uncomfortable or that you don't like. And you try to understand it and actually figure out, okay, of these options, which one actually makes the most sense to me, as opposed to just going with whatever you grew up with or whatever your friends think or whatever seems obvious at first to you. So in that way, I think you are kind of always in school because you're thinking about things differently once you get in that mentality, assuming you're not, just rushing through the classes and trying to get it done. If you're actually enjoying it, it does change how you think about a lot of things that you encounter. So in that sense, yeah, I would say so. Especially if you're writing some big paper on a topic and you're playing with both sides of the idea in your head, trying to figure out, okay, what actually makes the most sense here? Which side should I argue for?
I didn't realize that you had started off in business school. Can you tell me about the transition? Was it scary? Any of your sort of thoughts around that time and about that decision?
Yeah. I wouldn't say it was scary necessarily. I mean, I was fortunate in that my parents were very supportive of it. They were both lawyers. So and I think they knew that, or they trusted that I would be okay. I think my dad actually really didn't like the idea of studying business in undergrad. I didn't get it at the time. I get it much better now, but it's really a waste of 4 years to study a certain trade. I mean, I remember when I was interviewing you talked about how a marketing textbook can't keep up with how marketing is changing right now. And that's going to be true for so many things. And if you study a trade in undergrad, like marketing, finance, whatever, it's probably going to be at least somewhat outdated by the time you graduate, and you're likely to end up only using probably less than 10% of what you learn. So, I figured that, okay, these classes don't seem useful to me. I trust that they're actually not that useful and that I don't need them. And that if I do want to go into business stuff later, I can figure it out on my own. And I think, it helps that I can be a little cocky about that stuff. And so I was just like, no, I'll figure it out. It'll be fine. And it was also I was at that point where it was like, I need to do this because I can't do 3 more years of just hating school, right? It just psychologically, it didn't really feel like there was any other option for me. So I wouldn't say it was scary. It was kind of, once it was done and once I knew I was doing it, it was really liberating actually, because it was like, all right, for the first time, I'm actually controlling my education. I'm not just checking the boxes that somebody else has been putting in front of me, which I've been doing for all of elementary, middle, high school. It's what most people are doing, right? And when you make that switch to actually controlling what you're learning and directing it, it's really, really exciting and empowering.
Can you tell me about some of the check boxes that you had to do in elementary and high school? Because I imagine you had to have been prepping for Carnegie Mellon for quite some time in order to get in, right?
Yeah. To be honest, like it's just the normal grade stuff, right? So you have to show up and you have to study for the tests and you have to pass and like do well. It's just sort of like those checking boxes, right? With Carnegie, I actually didn't really know much about the school until I got in. And I went to a boarding school for high school called Choate up in Connecticut. And
I had a friend who went to Choate.
Oh, cool. Yeah. It's a very good school. So that helped a lot, I think, with applying to colleges in that, as a student there, I think I only had a 3.4 GPA or something, like something not that great, but the name brand. And like, I've always been kind of good at standardized tests. And so that was my like hack for the system, is that I could get away with not caring a ton about GPA and just having it be good enough as long as I did really, really well on the standardized test and other stuff to try to make up for it. But honestly, I hated that system like the whole time. And it always really felt like it just didn't make sense. And we know where it comes from and we know it's a really outdated system. It's like 1800s, early 1900s, right? You're training these people to go to factories. And originally where a lot of this came from was that you just had all of these young men hanging out, getting in trouble. And so we need to put them somewhere to distract them so that they're not like starting revolutions or killing people or anything, right? We need to like lock them in this building and teach them things all day until they can, go farm or whatever, right? And so much of that has just carried over, and the person at the front of the room lecturing and giving you tests is not because that's a good way to learn. It's because it's the most efficient way to like convey knowledge when you have limited resources in terms of people teaching and then a huge number of people listening, right? None of these things are designed because they're really, really good systems. They're just what's sort of evolved as efficiency solutions or over time or from industrialization. Like I could feel like there was something off about it. And so that when I say checking boxes, it was really just sort of okay, what's the bare minimum I can do to get away and do all right and not have my parents be like too annoyed about it, while still having plenty of time for, honestly, it was just like lots of video games back then. You
just mentioned that we currently see a lot of remnants from the old school system, as a pun. So what do you think the next shift will look like, if there will be a shift?
I think it's such a interesting issue right now because the college debt situation is absurd, right? Especially in the US. I don't think it's nearly as bad in Canada, right?
No, definitely not. I pay $1,400 a semester for university.
Wait, you pay how much?
I pay 1,400 Canadian dollars for university. It's the same at I believe every Canadian school when you're in the province, which is about like $25 US or whatever the exchange rate's at.
Oh my gosh, that's insane.
So we definitely don't have the debt issue that you guys have down south.
Yeah, for reference, Carnegie Mellon is like $25,000 per semester, right? It's absurd. And you've got I think it's one of the largest sources of debt in the country is student loan debt. And it's this absurd system where even if you go bankrupt, you can't get out of it. Right, you're locked into it for the rest of your life. And all of these colleges are, fighting with each other for having the biggest, nicest campuses and these state-of-the-art centers and just spending stupid amounts of money and hoarding a lot of it too in these massive endowments. You look at Yale, right? I think their endowment's well over $10 billion. They don't need $10 billion for anything, right? They could literally pay for every student's tuition every year, but they're not going to do it because they'd rather spend that money on building a new medical research center so they can get more, research funding from the government, things like that, right? So it's just so absurd how much money has been like poured into this institution and how it's all and all the like risk and the debt is transmitted to the students who are being told that the only way that they will succeed in life is if they go to college and they get these degrees. And we talked about this in our interview, but you don't really learn how to do a lot of the job stuff in classes. I think if you talk to almost anyone who's not in an extremely research science driven field post-graduation, they'll say that they did not use a significant portion of what they actually learned in college on the job. that's not necessarily true if you study something much more foundational, right? Like math, psychology, philosophy, writing, design. I think that those are probably honestly the only things worth studying. Because like we've been saying, any of these trade skills you just pick up on the job. And if we can, okay, so there's two answers to this, right? It's like, here's what I want and here's what will probably happen. So right now I'm saying what I want, right? And I mean, what I would like is one, for more people to realize that they actually don't need to study these things to go do them, right? There's that absurd notion that you can only, especially with something entrepreneurial, like, oh, you need to study entrepreneurship in college for 4 years and then you can start a business, right? Like that's absurd. But it's just as absurd to say that you need to do that for, marketing, writing, finance, almost every field that doesn't require an extremely strong like scientific base. You don't need the degree to do it. But why people think that we do is that a lot of these companies do use it as a first filter. So, let's say that you're IBM and you're looking at incoming data analysts or programmers or whatever, and you get 1,000 resumes per quarter, probably more than that, right? You're getting thousands and thousands of resumes. How do you go through thousands and thousands of resumes? Well, you need a quick filter. So you say, okay, well, we're only going to look at people from these universities and with this GPA, right? And then just get rid of everyone who doesn't meet that bar. And that's where the problem originates, right? Is this idea that you can't get this good job unless you have this piece of paper and this number, even though you as a student know that that piece of paper didn't really mean all that much. The number, the GPA didn't really mean all that much. The employer probably knows it too, right? If you talk to your interviewer and you ask them, hey, how much of your college stuff ended up being applicable on the job, they'll probably say the same thing. But then they will also go home and judge someone based on their piece of paper, right? It's this weird cognitive dissonance where despite knowing that it doesn't actually mean all that much, they still use it as a tool. And until that side of it changes, the need for the piece of paper and the GPA won't change. Now, thankfully, if you look at what a lot of smaller companies are doing, right? Silicon Valley, tech startups, things like that, none of them care about your degree and your GPA for the most part. The only time they start caring is, again, when they get too big to evaluate people based on their skills. But for any company under 100 people, you can probably have just as good of an opportunity getting in if you went in and you told them, like, hey, I didn't go to college. I've been doing all of this stuff on my own, right? Here's my portfolio. Here's the stuff that I've worked on. Here's some references from other people. And they're going to be really open to that because they can actually evaluate people on an individual level. And I think what we're seeing, which is really great, is that because these startups are starting to think more that way, where they're saying, no, you know what, we're going to evaluate people based on their skills and their abilities and what they've done, not based on the piece of paper and the GPA. And then when they get here, we're going to treat them really well and we're going to give them lots of benefits and all of this stuff. So many people are abandoning the old standby job types, right? People, going and doing banking, being like middle managers at large companies, some of the consulting stuff, even law stuff, right? And they're saying, no, like we would rather go to these tech companies where we're treated well and we're evaluated based on the skills and everything. And that's causing, I think, some of these other companies to rethink how they do hiring and how they take care of their people. I know a lot of law firms now are starting to look at allowing remote work for associates and partners, because so many people are quitting law to go work at a place like Evernote where you get unlimited vacation all year, right? Where you can just, as long as your work gets done and as long as you let people know, you can go take off and chill whenever you want, right? Because they want people to be happy. And it's such a more sane way of doing it. So, this is what I'm hoping we're moving more in the direction of, is evaluating way more on skill and ability than on these simple heuristics that we've had for decades. And I think that hopefully there will be better systems developed to allow for those kinds of evaluations, right? So we need some way to evaluate someone's programming skills, right? Really the only way to do it right now, as far as I know, is to sit down with them and, look through their code and see what they've built and all of that. It's really hard to evaluate a marketer, right? Because it's very unclear how much they actually contributed to a product's success versus just it being a good product. Writers, obviously, you can read their writing. Like, that's a really pretty easy one. But for a lot of this stuff, we don't have good standards for it. So as we get better at actually looking at people's abilities and not just these grades and papers, I think we'll move more and more in the direction of people actually getting way more out of their education instead of just trying to game the system, cheat, get the GPA. And hopefully we'll move more towards people not feeling like college is necessary unless you want to chill for 4 years and explore things, right?
Absolutely. So in there, you sort of implied that a lot of the sources of issues come from employees and other like evaluators looking for key metrics like the piece of paper, like the GPA, and then sorting based on that. What about people in college who actually don't want to be evaluated after they leave college, who don't want to go to IBM and get a job, but who want to be entrepreneurial, but also want to stay in college for whether it be parental pressure or they do enjoy college? How do you think they could best take advantage of their time there?
I would say find what foundational stuff is really interesting to you and study that. And that could be psychology, decision science, philosophy, math, writing, design, like physics, biology, chemistry, right? Study the things that just underlie reality and focus on that. Don't focus on the really end stuff, right? Don't study like marketing, accounting. You could even make an argument for not studying something like engineering in favor of studying physics and math. And the reason I say that is that, again, a lot of the really tactical stuff that you pick up in college is not going to be that useful, and you're not going to probably remember it when you get to the job. You're going to have to relearn it anyway, because I mean, if you're at all like me, then you're probably cramming for a lot of these exams last minute, and then you go in and you just sort of like barf it all up onto the paper, and then you go get drunk and forget all of it. And so it seems silly to like study the trade stuff, right? Study the foundational things that are really interesting to you, and then in your free time, pursue whatever trade or skill you want to get really good at and you want to work on, right? I think it's way more helpful to think in terms of skills and abilities than it is in terms of certain jobs, because if you're really good at certain skills, then there are millions of jobs that you can go after. But if you just think about a certain job, then you will really narrowly define your focus. And if you just focus on getting yourself into, say, like an accounting role at PwC, right, then you'll only really be good at accounting. And if you don't like it when you get there, or you decide you want to go do something else, you don't have that breadth of ability that would allow you to pursue other things. So whereas somebody who's really good at math could probably very easily get an accounting job, right? They just, study for their CPA, take it, go in, get the accounting job. Somebody who just studied accounting will not have all the same options as that person who studied math, right? So those foundational skills just give you much better optionality in what you go do afterwards. For me, that was really philosophy and psychology. So by doing the philosophy, I got much better at argumentation and writing. And by doing the psychology and decision science, all of that ended up playing really well into marketing. Because if you know a lot about psychology, you can pick up the marketing stuff very quickly. But if you just know the marketing stuff, you don't have that psychological base to go out and do other things. I think Wait But Why, waitbutwhy.com, he talks about this in a few different articles, that when you think about understanding something and learning something, you can think about it like a tree, where you've got your trunk and then your branches and then the leaves on those branches. A lot of the trade stuff and the job stuff are like the leaves at the ends of the tree, right? Well, so say you just have that accounting knowledge that we were talking about before, right? That's going to be the leaf at the end of the tree. And under that is going to be, some understanding of mathematics and like everything else that will go into accounting. But if you focus instead on that like tree trunk style knowledge, right, then it's really easy to fill in the leaves later. It's harder to create the tree in reverse. So that's definitely what I would do, right? Focus on the foundational stuff and then pursue whatever you're interested in skill-wise in your free time, right? Do some freelance writing, design, programming, marketing. The only thing that this wouldn't work for is if you're really set on going to med school or law school. But even then it might, right? Like maybe don't study pre-law and take lots of law classes in school, study philosophy and psychology and intern at a law firm. I feel like that will give you a much more accurate exposure to what it's really like working in law than these classes that aren't even in a law school. And then you've got this really strong base for when you do actually go to law school, right? So you can probably apply it to almost any field.
Right. Don't practice medicine outside in your free time. Definitely don't recommend that.
Yeah, maybe don't practice that one, but you could go shadow a doctor, right?
Yeah, there are ways. So beyond the classroom and meeting smart people, how do you think students can take advantage of being in this like little incubator called university for their 4 years? What can you do in university that you can less easily do afterwards?
Oh, I mean, the biggest thing is that you're so safe. You are so shielded from the challenges and risks of real life. And people take college way too seriously. They think that these classes matter and that it defines them as a person. And you're not going to remember any of the tests or exams or anything that you took after you graduated, right? It's all just this little artificial reality that you get to play around in for 4 years. And I think when you stop taking it seriously and treat it as a game and treat everything you do while you're there as exploring and trying new things, you get so much more out of it. Like, you're never going to be in a situation again where for 4 years of your life, you mostly don't have to worry about a lot of financial stuff. Even if you have loans and you're paying for your way through college and working on the side, it's not nearly the same as post-graduation when you have to do that, right? You have this big safety net from school where you can go and you can try whatever you want to try for 4 years and experiment and figure out what you like doing. And I think a lot of people, they come in and they lock themselves into one path that they think they'll really like or that'll make them happy. And they stick to that thing for 4 years because they think that, oh, I have to do this for 4 years or because that'll be the only way to be competitive. I mean, you'll be a much more interesting candidate for whatever you're doing. You'll be much more well-rounded. You'll have way more worldly interesting experience if you go out and try stuff and experiment and play around, and you'll actually get a better sense of what you like and dislike. It's really easy to just focus in on this one thing you think you want, go after for 4 years, graduate, get it, and then be unhappy and be stuck. And you don't want that to happen, because if you end up in that situation, it's going to be way harder to experiment and try new things when you need to pay for your apartment and pay for your food and you have all these other concerns. So do as much of that experimenting now when you're in college, when it's the safest time to do it. Because, even if you take time off to go like live in Paris and be a writer for a semester, like do that, right? Try it. See if you like it. Because if you don't like it, you can just go back to college and do something else. Same thing with the startup stuff, right? Take a semester or a year off and try doing a startup, right? Raise some money, try it, because it's way better to find out if you like that or not now than later when you need to be way more worried about feeding yourself and even, a family. So it's just 100% taking advantage of the safety and ability to experiment.
Awesome. Were you able to study abroad while you were in college?
I never did, and I kind of regret it because spending time abroad has been so, I guess I'd say, impactful and interesting to me since then. And I was very focused on stuff at school in terms of like people, organizations. I had a startup that I was working on for a year, so the timing just never worked out or made that much sense, but I wish I had.
I didn't go either, so I have nothing to add. It sounds like a cool experience.
and it's not really study abroad. It's like drinking abroad.
It's basically drinking abroad. You generally get pass-fail classes. I don't know if it's the same in the US, but generally when Canadian students go abroad, they get pass-fail classes. So it's drinking abroad.
For most of my friends who've studied abroad, that's pretty much how I understand it too.
Yeah. There are also a lot of institutions like, Major League Hacking and a bunch of things that you can do as a student that can really increase your university experience. What are some of those things that you would be looking for if you were to go back to university now?
You mean things provided by the college or beyond college?
Things provided by the college or things provided as a result of going to college, like 10% off groceries or people treating you nicely.
Oh, I mean, I think the biggest thing, I wouldn't look too much at institutional college stuff because, like, for example, don't join your college's entrepreneurship club for a couple of reasons. One, if there are these other students who are spending a lot of time on this entrepreneurship club, they're probably not actually that engaged in really entrepreneurial stuff. You're probably going to get stuck in like a entrepreneur think tank. And in most universities, unless you go to Stanford and a handful of others, any professor leading entrepreneurship stuff is not very good. Okay, that's a little harsh, but they're probably not who you're going to want to take advice from. You'll get much more exposure, like talking to people who are actually doing it. And that's sort of what I think the biggest benefit to being a student is that as long as you're a student, you can get away with reaching out to people way easier. People like helping students. It's much different when you've graduated and you're, supposed to be a responsible adult and you're reaching out to someone, asking them for advice and help. That's a really different pitch from, hey, I'm a student in university. I'm interested in being a full-time writer, can you tell me about, what your day looks like, right? People, I don't know what it is, but even when I get those kinds of emails, I feel way more inclined to respond to a college student than somebody who's graduated. So use that to your advantage. Like, be comfortable feeling dumb or embarrassed and just ask and reach out and hit people up on LinkedIn or Twitter or email. It's not hard to find somebody's email, and just send them whatever questions you have, because you're probably going to get good responses. People love that. And so few people do it that they'll really respond positively when you do. No one takes the effort.
Absolutely. It's totally you're able to game the system by being a student. People want to help you out as if you're this like little bird that they're going to help fly.
Exactly. And everyone remembers being a student and being confused about this stuff. All right. I remember when I was a junior and just starting to get interested in marketing and startup type stuff. And like, I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. Right. And I remember what it was like back then. And, if that Nat had reached out to this Nat, right, there's a lot of things that, I'd be more than happy to talk about and explain and help them accelerate some of that learning process. Right. Because everyone remembers what it was like to feel right at the beginning, feel a little ignorant about everything and the things that they wish they had known back then.
Do you have any strategies if people want to reach out to you or to other sort of people they find influential in their respective industry? What do you think are some of the strategies that they could reach out and get that cup of coffee or that phone call with those people?
I mean, I would say if you haven't, you should go listen to my interview with Charlie Hoehn. It was episode 4. He was sort of the master at this. He wrote a really good short book called Recession Proof Graduate, which talks about using free work as a way to get in the door with these entrepreneurs, to get some experience working with them, and then leverage that into bigger paid projects afterwards. That, okay, so all of that advice is really good and you should listen to that. But then, I mean, the other thing I would say is if you're coming at it from a point of humility and genuine curiosity, people are going to respond way better. In terms of the emails that I get and the outreach that comes into me, I'm way more likely to respond to someone who just has a genuine interest in something and has a good question than somebody who either acts like I owe them my time or who seems like they want to get something from me, right? If you're hoping that you'll be able to work with this person in the future, don't lead with that. Start by building a relationship with them. I have a couple of people who work with me on my site stuff, and all of those relationships started because they had questions about things I was writing about or working on, and they had reached out and we'd had a bit of conversation in the past, so that then when I was putting out hiring calls, as soon as I saw their application, it was a no-brainer, right? Because I knew that they were curious and interested and motivated, and they had that like good track record, or just like that relationship with me. So even if you want something down the line, right? Like, don't lead with that. Just, be interested and be really respectful of their time. Because if it's somebody that you want to reach out to, they probably have some kind of online presence or some reason that other people would want to reach out to them too. So while it's just one email for you, maybe they're getting 10, 20, 30 of those a week, and you don't want to like ask for too much right off the bat. Or I think it's, it's much riskier to say, hey, would you be free for coffee or something? Because if you had just asked the question or two that you wanted to ask in the email, they probably could have responded. But now you've asked them to take 20, 30 minutes out of their day to go somewhere to, it's a much bigger ask. So if you just start really, really small and ratchet up from there, right? Just one or two little quick questions they can send a quick response to, you're going to get a much better result. I mean, like, look at how we connected, right? you emailed me with just a few thoughts and responses to an episode, and then we started talking over email. And then, 6 or 7 episodes later, it was like, hey, let's do an episode, right? But if you had led with, hey, Nat, I'm a student and I would like to come on the podcast, I would have just probably archived it, right? Not to sound like a dick, but it's way better if you just start and build that relationship first before you try to get anything from them.
We also happened to meet at a pizza restaurant in a club in San Francisco.
That helps too.
So that helps. If you want to meet up with any blogger or someone in industry, just hope you meet up with them in a place that you don't live, in a club you've never been to.
Just hang out in clubs and cafes and wait.
Yeah, exactly. So did you feel competitive with other students during your time in university? And do you think that had any effect on how you did or how you comported yourself?
I did it first when I was still in the business school. And that was part of what I was trying to get away from as well, because that environment of, hey, you need to get a really high GPA and, take really hard classes so that you look good to recruiters afterwards creates a really nasty competitive environment within college, which ends up hurting everyone. And, a few things happen as a result of that. One, you're way more stressed out. You can't enjoy the classes as much because the goal is no longer learning. The goal is get a good GPA. You're not taking notes on what you're interested in. You're taking notes on what's going to be on the exam. And then it leads to a lot of cheating too, right? I mean, cheating was rampant at Carnegie and pretty much every other college where I've talked to someone, because you get into this weird like prisoner's dilemma where if you know that some of the other people in the class are sharing answer keys, or, one person takes the online test and then gives the correct answers to everyone else, you're at a disadvantage if you don't do it, especially if the class is graded on a curve, right? Because now your grade is going to be lower since their grade is higher, and their grade is higher because they cheated. So the only way for you to even get your grade back to normal is for you to cheat as well. And it's so frustrating because that logic checks out, right? It's very hard to argue with that. And yes, it's wrong. And yes, you shouldn't do it, but you're in this environment where you're being told you have to get this high GPA, you have to perform. And it's pretty easy to start to slip into those habits. So I really felt that pressure when I was doing a lot of the business stuff. But once I switched out and was doing philosophy and liked the classes and just completely stopped caring about grades and GPA, it was so nice to not feel competitive and to just be like, I don't care, right? It's like, I don't care what grades I'm getting. I don't care what grades other people are getting. And it was almost kind of fun to have that attitude, because then when everybody else was stressing and freaking out, right, you could just I could just sort of lounge back and say, oh yeah, whatever. Like, you don't have to be competitive. And so that was, it's such a healthier, much more enjoyable mindset to have towards classes in college.
I absolutely agree. That's actually all my questions.
Cool.
Thank you so much for all the wisdom. I very much appreciate it. I think your perspective on college is incredibly interesting, having actually gone to an incredible university and probably having put a lot of effort in while you were there. So thank you for that.
Yeah, no, this is a lot of fun, and hopefully can do more of this Q&A stuff for the podcast in the future too.
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks, Josh.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Nat Chat. If you enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe to Nat Chat in iTunes, Stitcher, Overcast, or wherever you get your podcasts. Second, if you're trying to take advantage of some of the information from this episode, be sure you check out the show notes at nateliason, nateliason.com/podcast, and find a friend, because implementing a lot of this stuff is much easier if you have somebody to do it with. And finally, if you enjoyed this episode and you've been enjoying other episodes of the podcast, please leave it a review on iTunes, Stitcher, wherever you listen to your casts, so that more people can find it. This is the best way for it to get some more exposure and to make sure that I can keep bringing these episodes to you. With that, thank you and have an awesome rest of your day.